Hi guys, so a couple of things. Firstly, apparently YouTube has a new feature called the hype button, so you can hype a video to help you get a boost. It does seem a bit hit and miss though, as you can only see it on mobile apps and the latest version, so no desktop. Apparently it will appear here. I have been looking at it on other channels and it seems to be there 1 minute and then gone the next, but I have clicked the option, so if you do happen to see a hype button underneath this video, then please hit it to help this channel grow. Secondly, just a warning, as this video involves a child victim. Obviously if this will upset you, then please click off now. Anyway, on with the video. During the evening of the 5th of January 2023, a fire engine attended reports of a Peugeot 206 on fire on the M61 near Bolton. This was a routine shout, but little did the firefighters know this would trigger the start of an investigation that would disgust the nation. In the car was a human placenta, showing that one of the occupants had recently given birth but then fled. Police were able to retrieve documents from the burnt out shell and identify Constance Marten and Mark Gordon as being the couple that had been in the vehicle. Checking their backgrounds made detectives' blood run cold. Mark was a rapist who'd spent 2 decades in prison in the US, and both had already had 4 children taken from them by social services as they were classed as unfit parents. Concerns only grew when CCTV footage was recovered showing the pair carrying a newborn baby just only in the baby grow, despite it being the middle of winter. What occurred next was a manhunt which crisscrossed the country and lasted 54 days, with police desperately attempting to save this child from 2 people who it could be argued are amongst the worst parents in Britain. However, this would all end in tragedy when human remains were found in a carrier bag in an allotment in the city of Brighton. I guarantee you, this case will boil your blood and make you question how selfish and self-absorbed 2 people can be. Welcome to Evil Among Us. The pair at the centre of this case, Constance Marten and Mark Gordon, were, on paper, complete worlds apart. Constance came from money and privilege, and Mark came from nothing and was a convicted rapist, but their coming together would form a toxic relationship which would result in the death of a newborn baby girl, in a case that would shock the nation. This is a complicated one though, and in order to fully understand what happened, I need to outline how Constance was, at different points in her life, both a villain and a victim. However, to be clear, this is just to help understand things better. I have no sympathy for either of them, as will become clear later. So Constance Dorothea Marten was born on the 16th of May 1987, the eldest child of Napier Marten and his wife Virginie. In reports I've read, they're described as an aristocratic family. Essentially this means they were both wealthy and well connected, and this shows in their lineage. So Constance's paternal grandmother, Mary Ann Marten, was the goddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother, and spent her childhood playing with Princess Margaret. Her father Napier came from money, and he was a multi-millionaire several times over, and was employed by the royal household, being a page for the late Queen. The family status was reflected in their home, which was the beautiful Critchell House in Dorset, a sprawling Georgian mansion in 5,000 acres of parkland. The house itself has at least 25 rooms, including a ballroom and a wine cellar. The whole estate actually includes 4 local villages, a cricket club, and an ornamental lake. Constance would eventually be joined by 3 brothers: Maximilian, the heir to the estate, when she was 1, Tobias, who followed 3 years later, and Frederick, who was born when she was 6. The 4 were apparently very close as children, and Constance later described an idyllic childhood running through the fields and having afternoon naps in hay bales and tractor scoops. Constance Marten was educated at Hanford Prep School, then at St Mary's Boarding School in Shaftesbury, Wiltshire, where fees were around £30,000 a year, and she rubbed shoulders with the children of royal family members, celebrities and diplomats. But whilst Constance grew up in luxury and received the best education, this didn't mean that she would automatically grow up to be a well-adjusted person. In fact, I think quite the opposite is often true. Some people who come from this sort of an environment, and I stress some, are self-entitled and arrogant. This is more so the case for children of the rich, those who have inherited their wealth and never worked for it. I mean, if you're born into privilege and had to do nothing to achieve this, but see others around you having to work for just a fraction of what you have, then this can breed arrogance and narcissism. Constance Marten epitomises this. She is one of the most narcissistic and self-absorbed people I've covered on this channel, someone who truly seemed to believe rules didn't apply to her, and she was entitled to special treatment in any environment, even in court. Trust me, I'll come back to this feature of her personality extensively later, but for now, I focus on the truly damaged person she was, which is linked to another trait of these types of households. Again, I'm making reference to some, not all. Specifically, these families can be cold and sterile places where parents are still stuck in the early 20th century, and they see having children as an obligation to carry on the family name, as opposed to having any real affection for their offspring. These children will then grow up to be extremely damaged adults with a range of issues, and then they will have children themselves and continue the cycle, and so on and so on. In the case of Constance Marten, behind the scenes, her childhood and early adulthood was a shit show. So it appears that her father Napier spent years deliberately avoiding the children, staying away overnight so he didn't have to spend time with them. Then in 1996, when his daughter was aged 9, he abandoned the family entirely in the most bizarre fashion. So buckle up for this one. Around this time, Napier was seeing a psychotherapist called Josephine Sellers, and apparently he began to believe that she was someone he'd known in a previous life. Specifically, he believed that 400 years ago he was living as a priest, and Josephine was the daughter of a wealthy noble Dorset family who he was tutoring. I shit you not, that is what he actually believed. And so Napier left the family home and went to discover himself, and flew to Australia, where he joined a group of Aborigines. Here, he claimed that one day he was on top of a cliff and had an out-of-body experience where his consciousness was able to observe his own sleeping body. Napier did return to the UK some years later, but rather than returning to his family, he lived in a lorry and worked as a chef before training in a form of head massage. He'd eventually end up working with one of his sons, Tobias, as a tree surgeon. This man sounds like a total fantasist and an utter dick. Fair enough, if you want to go find yourself, then crack on, but he abandoned his children, and it's clear this destroyed the family. Napier and Virginie soon divorced, and his estrangement from the family has clearly continued until at least very recently. Specifically, he was not present in the wedding photos of his eldest son Max in 2021, apparently because he was not invited. With regards to Constance's mother Virginie, 2 years after Napier left, she married a wealthy banker and moved the family to London. Here, she joined Holy Trinity Brompton. This is one of Britain's most renowned evangelical churches, which has become popular with figures such as Jerry Halliwell and Bear Grylls. She dragged her daughter along with her. In 2006, mother and daughter made a pilgrimage to the Synagogue Church of All Nations in Lagos, Nigeria, to hear the teachings of T.B. Joshua, an evangelical pastor who started the church in the late 1980s, who, thanks to an aggressive marketing campaign, was at its peak, attracting 2 million visitors a year from all over the world. He would regularly preach to thousands, apparently performing miracles such as getting the disabled to walk and curing people of HIV with just a few words of scripture. The reality was, Joshua was a cult leader who reportedly physically assaulted, raped and tortured his female congregants. A woman called Angie, previous disciple of the church, described it as, quote, a place of torture, psychological abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, and sexual abuse. Joshua would order female disciples to his bedchamber at night, where they would be raped. It's believed he did this to at least 12 women, but the number is clearly many times that. We'll likely never know the extent of his crimes, and he'll never be held accountable, as he died suddenly in June 2021. T.B. Joshua personally selected Constance, apparently to help run the church, and her mother left. She later disclosed that as soon as her mother was gone, she was cut off entirely from the outside world. She was starved, and when she was allowed to eat, It was Joshua's leftovers. She was woken at night to listen to readings from the Bible and forced to call Joshua Daddy. This term will be important for later. She also recalled, quote, "The leader looked me in the eye and said, 'Your family doesn't matter anymore. I'm your father now.'" We're going to play a clip of Constance Marten recounting her experiences in Nigeria, but I'm not sure when this video was from. I needed to provide context as she continues to use the word daddy to refer to Joshua, which I think is really creepy. Some of what she says contradicts what others who are in the cult have reported, especially regarding Joshua not targeting Caucasian women. In fact, they've stated that he would rape women regardless of their skin colour. What Constance is describing actually appears to be mild compared to the statements of other survivors who have reported pervasive child abuse, as well as people being whipped and chained.
Armoured guys outside each of the doors.
Okay, touch on that.
Okay.
That's a good point, yeah.
There's guys with guns outside each of the main entrances and exits. And TB Joshua, Daddy, would say that's for our own safety because the streets in Nigeria are so dangerous. Whether that's true is completely debatable. Obviously, Nigeria isn't the safest place to be in, but we obviously weren't allowed to leave the church, and we weren't allowed to use internet. You weren't allowed any contact with your family. I was specifically told when I joined, I had to hand in my phone to TB Joshua. There was no letters that could be written to you, because he said to us that if something detrimental happens to your family, then it will deter you off track from God, so it's better not to know. And I remember I was meant to go on my gap year with my best friend, and I had no way. We bought our flight tickets, and I didn't tell her that I was stuck in this place because there was no way of speaking to her. And I once tried to sneak into the internet department to try and email my mum, and the next day I got called into Daddy's office, and someone had obviously seen, or there was a camera that saw me, and I got in trouble for that. So there's no way of. We weren't allowed to read outside sources or any books that we had to give in. So there was no way that you could even find anything against him or know anything about the outside world or Nigeria.
Did you see any abuse or anything like that, or anything abusive sort of behaviour towards people?
It's all mental abuse. It's a breakdown of your character that you don't realise. And whenever we used to have these secret meetings at 4 o'clock in the morning, he used to say a name of any one of the disciples, and he'd make them, so everyone would make them stand up, and this is in front of 100 people, all the disciples, and you're kind of half asleep. There's a lot of sleep deprivation that goes on. You get about 3 hours sleep. Some people got 1 hour sleep a night because they were constantly working, and he'd make them stand up, and everyone was allowed to stand up and hack that person's character to pieces and say, oh, this person's this person's that. And it would really break someone down, so they'd become more and more attached to Daddy, and it was the only way that they could become a wholesome person. So there was a lot of mental playing around with. Nothing so much physical. A lot of the Nigerian girls said that physical things went on with them, but I don't think he would dare touch a white person because he knows that we could get out in the press.
Okay.
I think it's a really dangerous place to be, and I was only within the church for 6-7 months, and when I came out I was a completely different person. I was unsociable, I couldn't talk to people, I didn't find anything funny, I was really shy, my whole character had switched, and that was only being in there for 6 months. Now I've got friends who've been there for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and if they ever realise that he was a phony, I honestly don't think they would be able to carry on.
Whether Constance Marten was raped is unknown, but we can assume she was, at the very least, part of a cult for 6 or 7 months, being abused and broken down by a skilled manipulator who had been doing this for decades. Reports seem to vary about what actually happened in the end, with some saying that Constance was kicked out of the cult, others stating that she was helped to escape. A person who knew her around this time later told the press, quote, "Constance was badly traumatised by the whole thing. Everyone talks about 2 Constances, the person she was before she went to Nigeria and the person who came home. She was profoundly and fundamentally changed." However, in the short term, Constance Marten appeared to go on with her life as normal. In 2008, she attended Leeds University to study Arabic and Middle Eastern studies. This was the same year that Constance, whose nickname was Toots, appeared in Tatler magazine as their Babe of the Month. This publication is essentially about posh people for posh people. But despite the smiles, it's clear the trauma that Constance Marten had experienced was slowly beginning to chip away at her. In October 2012, when she was 25 years old, Constance reached out to Angie, who had also survived the cult, and messaged her saying, quote, "I haven't spoken to anyone about what happened at the synagogue. All my university friends are secular. If I told them about what I'd seen in Lagos, they'd think I was lying or mad." The pair met a few times, apparently for Constance to try and come to terms with her experiences. After graduating, she moved to London, where she worked as a researcher for the Arabic TV network Al Jazeera and gained a qualification in journalism. She then moved to Essex to study at the East 15 acting school with dreams of becoming an actress. I need to break here to highlight one other important trait of Constance before providing a mini summary of who she was in her mid to late 20s to lay the foundations for what comes next. So in terms of the important trait, it's clear that Constance Marten was extremely insecure, with a fellow student later stating, quote, "She's really inexperienced in men and can fall for whoever shows her love or shows attraction to her." The trauma she suffered in Lagos likely compounded this, with a former cult member of TB Joshua called Matthew McNaught stating that he believed, as a result of Constance's experiences in Nigeria, quote, "It does seem plausible to me that she would be very vulnerable to toxic or controlling relationships." This clearly built on her already extremely pronounced, for want of a better term, daddy issues. It's clear that Constance Marten, despite her privileged upbringing, was an extremely troubled young woman, raised in a cold and sterile environment, without any real love or nurturing. Her prig of a father, who sounds frankly unstable, abandoned her when she was young. I think it's apparent that she was desperately trying to fill that void in her life. Her mother left her in the hands of a cult, led by a man older than Constance, who she was forced to call daddy, twisting her underlying issues even more, and despite the fact she clearly experienced horrors in Nigeria, I think this began to normalise this type of behaviour, inexplicably linking abuse and control by men with love and being wanted. Constance Marten was in real danger of being taken advantage of by an older man, a predator, who would see her vulnerabilities and trauma not as something to help her overcome, but to take advantage of. Unfortunately, in 2014, when she was 27 years old, she would meet such a man, and his name was Mark Gordon, a convicted rapist who had spent 2 decades in prison for his crimes. He was 13 years older than Constance and was outwardly charming and charismatic, but beneath the surface, he was pure evil, with one of his victims describing him as, quote, "a devil in human's clothes." Within 10 years of meeting Mark, Constance went from dreams of treading the boards to sitting in the Old Bailey on trial for the manslaughter of a newborn daughter. In contrast to Constance Marten, Mark Alton Gordon came from nothing. He was born in London on the 8th of June 1974 to Sylvia Satchell, a single mother from Jamaica who already had 4 children. Mark never knew his father, who refused to meet him or support the family financially. They soon moved to the city of Birmingham. In court, Mark Gordon tried to portray his childhood as tough but loving, with his mother teaching him proper values and empathy, but this was clearly a lie. We don't know what happened behind closed doors, but it clearly twisted Mark into an extremely dangerous human being, and he would be barely into his teens when he would demonstrate this to the world. In August 1986, Sylvia decided to take Mark and his older sister Karen to live in the United States. They initially settled in New York, moving into an apartment in the Bronx. Mark was enrolled at the local middle school, where he was a grade A student and expressed an ambition to become a doctor. In the summer of 1988, when Mark was 14 years old, Sylvia took him with her when she went to visit her cousin in Florida. He was enchanted by seeing orange trees for the first time and begged his mother to move to the Sunshine State. And this is exactly what happened, and in early 1989, the family relocated to the Broward County area of Miami. Mark was enrolled at Hallandale High School, but apparently struggled to make friends and began skipping classes. According to his mother, he began sitting in his room, obsessively watching pornography. He was also prowling the streets, and he began spying on the female occupants of neighbouring houses with the intention of breaking in and raping them. This included a 30-year-old woman we'll call Denise, who was a single mother to a 7-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. Little did she know that for weeks, Mark Gordon, who was just 14 years old at this point, had been watching her from a ladder in his garden. And in the early hours of the 29th of April 1989, he decided to strike. That weekend, Sylvia was away, and so no one noticed Mark slipping out of the house, dressed all in black, armed with a 5-inch kitchen knife and a pair of rusty hedge clippers. He climbed into Denise's house through a bedroom window. The family dog began barking, and Denise got up to check everything was okay, only to be confronted by a masked man who ordered her back into her bedroom and told her to undress. Denise later recalled, quote, "I was shocked and I started to scream, but he said, 'Don't scream or I'll kill your kids.'" Fearing he would follow through with his threat, Denise didn't resist and was subjected to a horrific ordeal that lasted almost 5 hours, during which time she was raped. During the attack, Mark Gordon would regularly run the blade across her body, taking pleasure in her suffering. Denise remembered, quote, "He was so strange, so odd, that he couldn't have been normal. He was just, I don't even know how to describe him. The fact that he didn't talk, other than to order me around, he was almost not human. He was just an evil thing." At one point, the children woke up and knocked on her door and asked why she hadn't gotten up yet. Mark chillingly said to her, quote, "Your nightmare isn't over yet." Denise shouted to her children that she wasn't feeling well and was sleeping in, and they returned to their rooms. Eventually, Denise begged to be allowed to go see her children. She promised that she would open a door for her attacker to escape through, and they go to the children's room and close the door so he could leave. To her surprise, her attacker agreed. As soon as he was gone, Denise scooped up the children and ran to a neighbour's house where the police were called. Unfortunately, detectives were still investigating when Mark Gordon struck again. Approximately 3 weeks later, on the 21st of May 1989, Mark targeted another property a short distance away. This was the home of Patrick Nash and his wife Annette. Patrick and Annette were asleep in bed when at 6:30 a.m, Mark Gordon, armed with a heavy spade he picked up from the patio, removed the kitchen window and climbed in. He was dressed all in black, with a pair of tights over his head. He moved with purpose, clearly having scoped out the property already. He crept past the couple's sleeping 1-year-old son and entered the main bedroom. It's clear he was there to rape Annette and was not anticipating Patrick being there, but he was. Annette woke up and screamed, waking up her husband, who'd launched himself at the intruder. Mark reacted by smashing Patrick over the head with the spade before fleeing. With blood pouring down his face from a huge gash in his head, Patrick chased his attacker before collapsing on the floor. His wounds were so severe that his head had to be stapled back together at hospital. 3 days later, a Florida detective was conducting house-to-house inquiries when he was informed of Mark walking around the neighbourhood, acting suspiciously and looking nervous. The detective spoke to him, and eventually Mark blurted out, quote, "I did it. I went into her house." He initially claimed that a man called Jerome had forced him to commit the crimes at gunpoint, but then dropped this story and confessed that he'd acted alone. He was eventually linked to both offences. However, when it came to court, he denied his guilt, but in March 1990, Mark Gordon was convicted of 1 count of armed kidnapping, 4 counts of armed sexual battery, and 1 count of burglary with a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but on appeal, this was changed to a sentence of 40 years. Mark Gordon spent 20 years in prison, all the while protesting his innocence. He apparently became known as the Preacher due to him frequently quoting passages from the Bible. He also completed a number of distance learning courses, earning at least 1 degree, and this is the thing to remember in this case. Mark Gordon was not just some mindless thug. He was intelligent, savvy and cunning, making him infinitely more dangerous. His sister Karen Setchell has given a number of interviews where it's clear her intention is to defend her brother. She's claimed that his original conviction in the US was as a result of being framed by the police, and has denied his culpability for more recent events, as well as trying to claim that her brother was simply a follower being manipulated by Constance Marten, when, as we'll get to, they were as bad as each other. However, in these interviews, she appears to have inadvertently identified the danger of her brother, including her stating, quote, "There's a look in his eyes that would make you shut up. You shut up and agree with him. He does these weird stares. He's not a person who had to do anything action-wise. You would look at him and go, leave that man alone." So Mark Gordon was a man who expected others to simply shut up and agree with him. A man who, as a teenager, posed an extreme danger to women, who no doubt saw them merely as objects to use and abuse, who has spent 2 decades denying his guilt and likely doing nothing to address his offending, who was intelligent and by all accounts charismatic. What could possibly go wrong? In January 2010, after serving 20 years behind bars, Mark was released from prison in the US and deported back to the UK. He was required to register with the police due to being a sex offender, but he quickly ignored this instruction. He settled initially in East London and became a labourer. However, Mark Gordon is a narcissist, someone who would never admit any fault, someone who believes he's special and needs others to see him in that way, and so when he saw his family, he would be dressed in business suits, talking about stocks and shares, as well as potential jobs in finance he was being offered. Soon after arriving in the UK, he began a relationship with a Greek national. Almost no information is available about this woman outside of what his sister Karen has disclosed. Specifically, the relationship produced 1 child, a little girl, and Mark moved in with her and her mother in Ilford in East London. However, in 2014, this relationship apparently broke down suddenly, and mother and child returned to Greece. I don't think it's a stretch, considering what I'll go on to tell you, to think that this was Mark's first victim in the UK, a woman he likely abused and controlled from day one, who eventually felt that she needed to flee the country to get away from him. Like most domestic abuse perpetrators, I've no doubt that Mark Gordon was a predator. He could sense weakness in others, but what he wanted was a troubled woman he could sponge off, dominate, control and manipulate. 2014, just a few months after his former partner had escaped back to Greece, by chance, Mark met Constance Marten, someone 13 years younger than him, whilst both were in an incense shop in Tottenham, North London. Within moments, I imagine he sensed she was a damaged woman, the perfect Mark, and they began a toxic and abusive relationship which lasted a decade, and which eventually cost the life of a newborn baby. The quote-unquote relationship between Constance Marten and Mark Gordon was a whirlwind, and she quickly became absolutely besotted by him, later telling the court that she knew almost straight away that he was her soulmate. Constance's family met Mark and were instantly concerned. He was over a decade older than her and had been in prison, although they didn't know what for. However, any objections they raised were met with accusations of bigotry and racism by Constance. This drove a wedge between her and her family. The dynamics of the relationship are indicated by the fact that Constance called Mark, quote, "Daddy Bear," which I think gives strong vibes of the cult she was in Nigeria, where she'd been forced to call her abuser Daddy. Constance soon dropped out of drama school and cut herself off from any of her friends. All of her time and energy was solely devoted to Mark Gordon. In 2016, the pair went backpacking in South America, eventually getting married in Peru, but this was a ceremony that isn't recognised in the UK. Whilst they were away, Constance's family had contacted US authorities to find out Mark's full criminal history, and they were appalled when the information came back. Their feelings turned to absolute horror when, upon returning to the UK in 2017, they found out that Constance Marten was pregnant. However, she had no intention of listening to her family, and after an argument, she cut them off. One source close to the family later stated, quote, "Out of the blue, she sent a text saying she had chosen to live her life in a different way. She told us this was her decision, and hers alone, freely made, and she did not want any of us to try to contact her again, nor to try to meet up with her, and she wanted everyone to respect that, for better or worse." Up to this point, I focused on Constance Marten, the victim, and whilst this will come up again, from this point on, we'll focus more and more on her as the villain, a woman who showed absolutely no regard for anyone but herself, who failed as a mother, not once, but 5 times. So Constance didn't attend antenatal checks until she was 6 months pregnant, and when she finally attended St Mary's Hospital in London in June 2017, she told midwives she was living in a camper van. When she stopped coming to appointments, worried medical staff issued a national alert, asking other hospitals to look out for her and Mark, but by this point, they'd already left London. Part of their reason for fleeing the area seemed to be not only the concerns of medical professionals, but also because Constance's family had hired private investigators to track her down, likely due to concern for not only her safety, but that of the baby. I mean, after all, she was somewhere in the country, pregnant, with a convicted rapist. However, Constance saw this differently. Her family were trying to tell her what to do. She knew better. No one was going to dictate what she did with her life. This is the first example of Constance Marten, the narcissist, the self-absorbed child trapped in a woman's body. She wouldn't reach out for help or do anything which would make her look weak in any way, even if it jeopardised her baby's health. As we'll see, she seems to have been so immature that she would do the exact opposite of what people said just to be defiant. Mark Gordon no doubt fostered and magnified this. He too did not like being accountable for his actions or being told what to do. He was known to have registered with the police, but after doing this once, he'd not bothered after this point. It seems they both convinced themselves that everyone was after them. It had to be the two of them against the world, and they went off grid. This began with them moving to Wales, living in a tent in the Carmarthen area. When it was finally time for the birth in November 2017, Constance and Mark finally went to hospital, but she put on a fake Irish accent, calling herself Isabella O'Brien, and Mark was now James Amer. Constance stated that she was from a traveller community, lived in a caravan, had never been to school, and had never been to a GP. This was her poor attempt to explain why no one could find any trace of her. The hospital were not buying any of it, and they checked the hospital alert notices and quickly put two and two together, and the police were called. When they arrived, Constance was in labour, and when confronted, Mark Gordon showed the monster that he is. Right in the middle of the ward, he kicked the fuck off. He assaulted two police officers and was so out of control, the fathers who were there to support their pregnant wives jumped into the melee to try to restrain him. Eventually, he was pepper sprayed and cuffed. He was taken to court within days, pleaded guilty, and was sent to prison for 20 weeks. Social services became involved and visited the tent where the couple had been staying, and they were appalled. The tent was bowing with the weight of rainwater, and there were bags of rubbish and bottles of urine scattered about. With Mark Gordon temporarily out of the way, Constance went to stay in a placement for mothers and babies who need extra support, but there were soon questions about her ability to safely care for a child. Social workers found she was drinking wine in her room instead of looking after a baby. She was also found to have the newborn asleep on her chest. She was told repeatedly the dangers of this, that she may roll over and crush the child. However, Constance continued to do this, likely deliberately doing the exact opposite of what she was being told to do as an act of defiance, even if it meant putting her baby in danger. Social services were then granted a supervision order, meaning they would be able to monitor the family and the child. The authorities were now in their lives, and Constance and Mark were determined to make things as difficult for them as possible. Any offer of help was refused. They were rude, obnoxious, and evasive, and the case repeatedly ended up in family court to determine whether the child should be taken from their care. Each hearing turned into a circus, with both parents employing delaying tactics, lying and shouting in court, and this was successful in the short term, and they were able to keep custody of their firstborn. The couple then returned to London, staying at various properties, often short-term lets, which they would frequently leave without paying the rent before moving on. Social services were hovering in the background, and despite Constance Marten and Mark Gordon not being able to take care of one child, in 2019 she gave birth to their second. Constance was pregnant with baby number 3 in 2020, but this time things were different, and the authorities stepped in directly after an incident which could have killed both mother and baby. Specifically, Constance Marten, when she was 14 weeks pregnant, apparently fell from a first-story window, shattering her spleen. When the ambulance crew turned up, Mark refused them entry and told them to fuck off, so the police were called. The family court later determined that on the basis of probabilities, Mark had pushed his pregnant partner out of the window during an argument. Constance spent 8 days in hospital, and luckily the baby was not harmed, but she got wind of the fact that the wheels were in motion to take the first 2 children away from her, and so she fled to Ireland with them. When she returned a few weeks later, both of the children were taken away from her. When Constance gave birth to the third child in 2020, the they were quickly taken into care as well. So now 3 children have been removed from their care, but within weeks, Constance Marten was pregnant again with baby number 4, and this time they attempted to conceal the pregnancy as much as possible. Constance didn't attend any appointments to check on the welfare of the baby, and only came to the attention of the authorities on the 5th of May 2021. This is where midwives at Sydenham Green Health Centre in London received a self-referral from Constance. An urgent appointment was made for her to see a midwife, but she failed to attend. Imagine what happened was that Constance believed there was a medical emergency, but this passed, and so she refused to engage. To try and throw off the authorities, she told the medical staff at the hospital that she was going to be privately treated, but refused to give any information. Social services were soon aware and were at the front door. Constance opened it a crack, standing in a way to hide her belly. The social worker called her out and said they knew she was pregnant. Again, Constance tried to claim that she was receiving private health care, but refused to give any details. Arrangements were made for child number 4 to be taken from her care almost immediately upon its birth. Baby number 4 was eventually born at Lewisham Hospital in 2021 at full term with no medical concerns. The actions of both Constance Marten and Mark Gordon related to this child especially highlight their complete indifference to any of their children. So a few days after the baby was born, both parents, I use that term loosely, said that they had to leave to go to a court hearing related to the other children. The hospital said they would organise a video link to the court, highlighting how both should be looking after their child, not expecting nurses to do this on top of their duties. They were warned if they left, they would be considered to have abandoned their child. Despite this, they left. There was no court hearing. Where they went or why is not known. The next day, both Constance and Mark returned and refused entry back onto the ward. They kicked off. Despite the fact they'd been warned about the consequences, they were shouting about their rights as parents and that the hospital was stealing their baby. Child number 4 was then taken into care. Initially, they were not blocked entirely from seeing their children. Constance and Mark were allowed to have supervised visits with all of them in a contact centre, and these seemed to go well at first. Constance would play with the children, sing to them, and comfort them if they were upset. In contrast, Mark Gordon, whilst he was there, was always distant. He was clearly indifferent about any of the children. However, they both began missing visits, and eventually these stopped altogether, and in January 2022, the family court formally ordered that Constance Marten and Mark Gordon be stripped of their parental rights to all 4 children, and they were placed up for adoption. Before moving on to child 5, whose death would make national headlines, I want to summarise what I've covered so far and really hammer home the depravity and selfishness of Constance Marten and Mark Gordon. I've no doubt that Mark, as I said, sensed Constance's vulnerability, a desperate need for a man, any man, to want her. I think she told Mark about the cult, and he saw right away he could take the place of TB Joshua, hence they both demanded they be called Daddy. She was utterly controlled and dominated by him. I also firmly believe that Constance was subjected to horrific abuse at the hands of Mark, and that being thrown from a first floor window was likely just the tip of the iceberg. He's a fucking monster, no doubt. But I think he also tapped into something in Constance that was already there, her self-absorption, her narcissism, with him reinforcing to her that she was better than everyone else. Her family didn't like their relationship. Well, fuck them, we'll show them. Let's have a baby. To Mark Gordon, I think like so many domestic abusers, children to him were a way to tie Constance in for life, although I think there may be more to his motivations, which I'll return to later. But for her, it was to initially show to her family, see, you told me not to do it, I did it anyway, like an absolute immature brat. As more agencies and people became involved, she dug her heels in like a 2-year-old. This became about defying the world. She wanted to have a child, not because she actually cared or loved anyone but herself and her daddy, but to hold them up and say, nah, you tried to stop me, but look how I defied you. I don't actually want this kid, but fuck you all. To both of these monsters, children were not little humans to cherish and protect. They were currency, objects to hold up like trophies. Neither had any fucking idea what they were doing, nor did they care, and their last child, baby Victoria, would pay the ultimate price for their evil. whilst the names and genders of the first 4 children of Constance Marten and Mark Gordon have not been published, we do know the name of their 5th. Her name was Victoria. In this section, I'll not only talk about her short life, but also interweave it with the police's hunt to try and save her. So Victoria was conceived in around April 2022. As opposed to either of her so-called parents learning from their mistakes, putting this child first, and realising they needed to work with authorities in order to keep their daughter, they went to great lengths to hide the pregnancy, avoiding any missteps they'd made in the past, to ensure no one knew about the existence of this child. Constance remained out of sight the majority of the time, as she made no efforts to contact any hospital or doctor during the entire pregnancy. By September 2022, when she was likely around 5 months pregnant and her bump would clearly have been visible, Constance and Mark made preparations to disappear. She had been stockpiling money in order for them to go off grid again. The issue of money is important in this case. I need to mention it to highlight how fucking unnecessary everything that comes next was. How Constance Marten had access to resources that most of us can only dream of, and yet she still chose the path she did. It's something I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. So when I say stockpiling money, I'm not talking about pennies here and there, I'm talking about tens of thousands of pounds. Court records indicate that by this point, Constance was receiving £3,400, so around $4,500 a month, as an allowance from her family's estate as a basic. It's clear she could request additional money when she needed it, which she did. The amount of money she had access to is staggering. As an example, in a 4-month period, from the end of 2022 into 2023, Constance Marten received £47,000, or around $63,000, from a family estate. She took out thousands of pounds in cash. The rationale was clearly to not use ATMs after they disappeared, as this would be flagged and could be used to trace them. With preparations completed, they left their East London home. Despite the amount of cash they had, they left without paying their rent, began living out of Airbnbs, staying for a few days before moving on. They crisscrossed the country for the next 4 months to avoid detection, using false names and keeping to themselves. Unfortunately, this was successful. When and where she was actually born is not known. Both Constance and Mark lied so frequently during their subsequent trial, it's difficult to believe anything they say. But it seems that Victoria likely came into the world whilst the pair was staying in a holiday cottage in Northumberland on the 26th of December 2022, Boxing Day. However, the police believe that she wasn't actually born in the property, but rather in the back of the Peugeot 206 vehicle that they were using at that point. The pair left the cottage with Victoria, but not before trashing the place. This act of wanton destruction just demonstrates what this pair were like. They literally had no reason to do this, but it seems wherever they went, they could not help being pricks and acting like children. It's like kids trashing a hotel room before they leave, thinking it's really funny, and these were the people that Victoria was unfortunate enough to have as her parents. During the evening of the 5th of January 2023, Mark Gordon, Constance Marten and baby Victoria were travelling along the M61 near Bolton in their Peugeot 206, when at around 6:30 PM it broke down and caught fire. I thought initially, when I heard about this story, this was a deliberate act, but it appears it was due to some catastrophic fault with the vehicle. They scrambled to get out, but many of their possessions were destroyed, and they were unable to retrieve items that would be used to trace them. This included Constance Marten's passport. In addition, £2,000 in cash also went up in flames, along with a pile of burner phones the pair had been using. Obviously, there was also Constance's placenta. Whilst the fire engine was speeding to the scene, Constance and Mark were making their way out of the area. They managed to get a lift into the nearby city of Bolton, and then moved on to Liverpool, and then they took a taxi journey over 200 miles to Harwich in Essex, arriving in the early hours of the 6th of January. The taxi driver who took the couple saw baby Victoria zipped up inside Constance's coat, and despite it being the depths of winter, she was only wearing a nappy. They then spent the day in the town. Fair play to Greater Manchester Police, they quickly put 2 and 2 together, and less than 24 hours after the car fire, they had released pictures of both Constance Marten and Mark Gordon, as well as making the public aware they were likely travelling with a newborn and asking for help tracing them. After staying in a hotel in Harwich, on the morning of the 7th of January 2023, Constance and Mark were spotted around the port in the town, where they were confronted by a member of the public who had seen the news reports. This witness said they'd heard a baby crying and saw Victoria wrapped up in Constance's coat. This information was relayed to the police, but by this point, the pair had disappeared. They jumped into a taxi, which took them to Colchester in Essex, and then they took another one to East Ham in London. Horrifyingly, this is the moment when CCTV captured glimpses of baby Victoria, including her in the back of the taxi when the couple first arrived. Later that day, Mark bought a buggy in Argos, assembled it, and met Constance in a local kebab shop, where you see her holding Victoria and putting her in the buggy. Notice that despite it being the middle of winter, she's only wearing a baby grow. Constance was also captured walking the streets, obviously tried to conceal her face with a bump under her jacket. This was little Victoria, but she wasn't in any sort of sling, she was merely being pressed against her mother's chest. Still on the 7th of January 2023, the couple took a number of taxi journeys across London, where they acquired tents and sleeping bags. At no point was there any evidence of them buying any sort of winter clothes for Victoria. They, however, tried to find ways to keep themselves warm, including stuffing their clothes with newspaper. In the evening, they were spotted in Haringey, in the north of the city, where inexplicably, the buggy that had been bought earlier that day was abandoned, and instead, Victoria was simply carried around in a shopping bag. Another long-distance taxi journey took them overnight to the town of Newhaven on the south coast, arriving there at 5 a.m. on the 8th of January 2023. They were captured on CCTV wandering around. They were not seen again for 4 days. Later, it would be discovered that they'd set up camp in some open fields on Cantercrow Hill. This was the depths of winter. Temperatures overnight could drop to below zero. They had no warm clothing for the baby, and apparently Constance Marten would simply pull Victoria towards her for warmth. Again, it needs to be highlighted how ridiculous this all is. It's reported that by this point, Constance Marten still had £19,000, or around $25,000 in her bank account, but chose to sleep in a field in the middle of winter rather than getting a warm place for her baby to stay, or even buying her appropriate clothing. It was here that baby Victoria quickly died. According to Constance Marten, on the first night, she fell asleep, sat upright, with Victoria pressed against her chest. But when she woke up on the 9th of January, quote, "My head was on the floor. When I woke up, she was not alive." In court, Constance clarified that she was claiming that she slumped on top of her daughter during the night, smothering her. We will never know whether this story is true, as Victoria's remains were too decomposed to determine a cause of death. However, I personally think this is a lie. I think this is Constance trying to frame the death of her daughter as being a tragic accident. In the end, the judge in her case concluded it was most likely Victoria died of exposure, so essentially she was killed by the cold. We don't even know if the date of death is correct. Constance could have lied about that too, but assuming she wasn't, baby Victoria's short life lasted just 15 days. On the 12th of January 2023, the couple re-emerged, being captured at a nearby petrol station. They then travelled to Stanmer Park in Brighton and set up another camp and went to ground again. It's important to state here that they'd been travelling with Victoria's body, carrying it in a shopping bag. By this point, multiple police forces up and down the country were searching for Constance and Mark in a desperate attempt to save their newborn baby. On the 30th of January, the Metropolitan Police offered a £10,000 reward for information to track down the pair, but it would be several weeks until the next sighting, with them being captured on CCTV trying to break into Hollingbury Golf Course on the 20th of February 2023. A week later, on the 27th of February, 54 days after their car caught fire near Bolton, the net would close in on this evil pair. Just before 9 p.m, they entered a Mulberry's convenience store and were spotted by a member of the public, who called the police. They rushed to the scene and intercepted the pair a short distance away on Stanmer Villas, and their only question was, where is the baby? Notice how you hear Constance call Mark Gordon Daddy Bear. This whole thing is so fucked up.
Hello, sorry mate. You stop for a second. Stop for a while, I need to speak to you. Well, because potentially I think you may have been in national news. Right, you can't wait for me. So, put the stick down. Drop it now.
What?
Put the stick down and I'll explain.
Alright.
Put the stick, let go of the stick. The stick in your hand.
Alright.
Let go of the stick. Right, at this moment in time, until I can confirm who you are, you're both under arrest on suspicion of child neglect. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned, something was lying in court, anything to think evidence. Do you understand?
Hey,
Right.
let me eat.
I'll let you...
Food.
Right, at the moment you...
Put the stuff down, we're going to put you in cuffs, and then we will talk about you eating.
Let me have my food.
No.
You can have... Shit.
Oh, look at the photo on there.
Oh, where's the child, madam?
Where is the child, please?
Daddy bear.
Look at me.
Constance.
Constance, Arabella, whoever you are.
Right, where's your child?
Have we searched her? Sooner you
Yeah,
tell
this
us.
isn't at the front, is it? I've just asked, I'm going to undo it now, I've just...
I'll level with you. You're under arrest for child neglect.
Where is your child?
You are under arrest for concealment of the birth of a child.
How's that? That's not arrest.
Alright. And section 27, Offences Against a Person Act, expose a child under the age of 2 years, whereas by life or health to be endangered. Do you understand what you've been arrested for?
Last time, not the first two.
Right.
Can't arrest someone for hiding pregnancy.
Right, okay, well that's...
It's not an arrest
there,
offence.
okay, they are the offences that I've arrested you on suspicion of. The necessity for your arrest is protect from person and prevent disappearance. Do you understand that you've been arrested? Section 27, Offence Against the Person Act, expose a child under the age of 2 years, whereas life or health is to be endangered. Do you understand? Do you understand what I've said to you? Do you understand what I've said to you? You've been further arrested for 3 more offences. What are the...
Where's your child, my friend? Where's the child?
And my food, please.
In a minute, where's your child?
Yes, and Christmas.
Where's your child?
Food?
In a minute. Where's your child? Where's your child?
And my food, please.
In a minute, where's your child?
My food.
Not on the
What are you
moment.
grabbing me for?
Where's your
Is
child?
that aggression necessary?
He's not being aggressive.
Of course you are. I'm not doing anything inside you.
Where's the child?
I want food.
We want to know where the child is.
Have my food.
Is the child alive?
I want food, please.
Is your child alive? Where's the child?
Food?
Where's the child?
Both were taken into custody and interviewed, and neither would answer questions about the location of Victoria. Detectives likely knew at this point that this child was no longer alive, and their worst fears were realised 3 days later, on the 1st of March 2023, when officers searching the area located a carrier bag hidden on an allotment near to where the couple were found, which they then opened. Inside were the badly decomposed remains of Victoria. Her body was in such a bad condition that the reason why she died, as I already stated, could not be determined. I want to play this short clip from the moment when Constance Marten was told her baby was dead. These few seconds show how evil she truly is.
We have found a baby. Constance, I can tell you, the baby's not alive.
I know.
Go on.
Do you have a question or?
Is it your baby?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay. So just to clarify, you just told me the baby that we found this evening
Yeah,
is your baby.
yeah.
Right. Tell me about her, Constance. Take your time. Constance. There is no rush, Constance. I can see it's very, very distressing for you.
In contrast to the indifference of her own mother, the nation was devastated by the news that the missing child was no longer alive. At this stage, the name and gender of the newborn had not been revealed, so Victoria was simply referred to as Baby A in the news. This didn't stop people from expressing their sorrow, and on the 2nd of March 2023, a candlelit vigil was held in Brighton, an outpouring of grief from people who had never met Victoria but loved her more than these two monsters. The next day, the 3rd of March, Constance Marten and Mark Gordon appeared before Crawley Magistrates Court, having been charged with gross negligence manslaughter concealing the birth of a child, and perverting the course of justice. They were remanded into custody to await their fate. Constance Marten and Mark Gordon denied all charges against them, and their trial began at the Old Bailey in London on the 26th of January 2024. There was already hatred towards the couple in the press, and this only increased during the proceedings. Neither showed any remorse for what they'd done. Like with the family court years before, they did everything they could to disrupt being held accountable for their crimes. Both, on separate occasions, refused to attend court and claimed to be ill. With Constance Marten, she went through 14 barristers. Some she fired, others withdrew because of her behaviour. The common theme was that she would not listen to any opinion that differed from her own. A source close to the legal team, when asked why she'd gone through so many barristers, responded, quote, "Because she thinks she's entitled and doesn't listen to instructions." There was delay after delay because of these tactics, meaning the trial ran for 3 months longer than it was scheduled. When they were actually in court, their behaviour was appalling, yawning, laughing and sighing whilst the case unfolded. At one point, when a witness was giving evidence, Constance wrote a note which was passed to the judge, which said, quote, "Could I nip out for a coffee, as we're falling asleep?" The pair appeared fixated on each other, giving each other simpering, gooey looks, and on one occasion, after the judge had left, Constance was heard to say loudly, quote, "Will you stop flirting with me?" They were also rude and abusive to dock officers who brought them from the cells under the court every day, and on one occasion, Constance Marten refused to go to court unless one of these officers was changed, and she demanded to speak to his manager. At the beginning of March 2024, Constance gave evidence, and her ramblings showed a complete disconnect from reality, lack of remorse, and continuous victim mentality. Everyone else was at fault, apart from her. Her evidence included this exchange between her and her defence barrister. Sir Barrister asked her, quote, "Did you do anything to harm Victoria?" Constance replied, "Absolutely not." "Did you do anything cruel to baby Victoria?" "No, I did nothing but show her love." "So far as you are concerned, did you give her anything less than the proper care you thought she deserved?" "I gave her the best that any mother would, yeah." When asked about whether Victoria being in a tent in the middle of the winter was a good idea, she responded, quote, "Obviously, it would be preferable to be in a house. That's just common sense, but at no point did I think she was a danger. Our whole reason for being in the tent was for Victoria. She was very well protected and looked after." Constance described the death of Victoria as being devastating, then added, quote, "They'd have a field day out of this, the media, the press, social services, everyone, because she was in my care. I panicked and thought, how am I going to get my other kids back now that Victoria has passed away?" All of what Constance Marten said in court shows her utter level of self-absorption, but I think this comment highlights this so perfectly. After the death of her daughter, her greatest concern was how she would be perceived in the news, and the impact it would have on her getting what she wanted. I don't think there's a word to describe how vile this woman is. Constance also said that her and Mark had considered burying Victoria, but were too weak from hunger to do so. Remember, this is a woman who had 19 grand in the bank. They also bought petrol, apparently to cremate her, but decided against this. Instead, she was simply thrown away like rubbish. She also railed against the family court proceedings, which has seen her first 4 children taken into care, with her describing it as, quote, "one of the most disgraceful cases if anyone looked at it objectively from the outside," before adding, "Mark and I love our kids more than anything in the world, so I'm pretty angry that we had to go through this process. There is literally nothing I wouldn't do for my children." At the conclusion of the first trial, both Constance Marten and Mark Gordon were convicted of concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice, but the jury couldn't agree on the charge of gross negligence manslaughter, and so a retrial was ordered, which began at the same venue on the 10th of March 2025. With the start of the trial, the circus was back in town. The disruptions continued, but this time with even more bullshit thrown into the mix. So Mark Gordon decided to represent himself, and then spent the entire time bellyaching about the fact he knew fuck all about what he was doing. He demanded a desk, power to make legal decisions, and law books. He complained repeatedly about the fact that he needed more time to prepare for his case, and the judge at one point quipped back, quote, "Do you want me to adjourn for 3 years while you do a law degree." Mark then began prattling on like an utter prick, at one point beseeching the royal family to step in on his behalf, saying, quote, "I ask the king in his mercy and those who work for him to help me." One of the most bizarre moments during the second trial was when Mark questioned Constance, and their exchange included the following. He said, quote, "Who was hands-on and gentle with the kids?" She responded, "Both of us, especially you." "Was the baby always a priority?" she was asked. She said, "Absolutely. That's why we did what we did. Our number one priority was Victoria. We were doing what we were doing for her." When it came to giving evidence again, Constance Marten was still a victim. She said that her previous 4 children had been, quote, "taken by the state for no reason." This had prompted her actions related to concealing the birth of Victoria and moving around the country with her. Constance Marten railed against her own parents, appearing to believe some all-encompassing conspiracy that they had an army of people looking for her across the country, and they would stop at nothing to take Victoria away from her. With not a hint of irony that she was essentially describing herself in one succinct sentence, Constance said, during her rant about her family, quote, "Some people who are privileged think they're above the rules." On the 14th of July 2025, both Constance Marten and Mark Gordon were found guilty of gross negligence manslaughter of their newborn baby Victoria. When the verdicts were read out, Constance shouted, quote, "It's a scam," whilst Mark said it was an unfair trial, before turning to the dock officer and saying, "I'm actually happy with the result because I'll win the appeal." I mean, what the hell is he talking about? Happy to be found guilty because you'll win on appeal. If you'd been found not guilty, there wouldn't be an appeal. What an absolute penis. On the 15th of September 2025, the pair were back in court for sentencing in front of Judge Mark Lucraft KC. This was the last opportunity to be as disruptive as possible, and these evil pair took full advantage and were talking to each other, gesturing and passing notes in the dock. Eventually, the judge delivered his remarks. Part of these included him saying, quote, "To most right-thinking people, their children are the most precious beings, to be nurtured and cared for, to be kept warm, to be fed, even at the expense of the parent's own comfort, and above all, to be loved. What you did towards baby Victoria, despite all you claim to have done, can only be described as neglect. Neglect of the gravest and most serious type that led ultimately to her death by your gross negligence. In my judgment, there's been no genuine expression of remorse from either of you. Whilst there have been expressions of sorrow about the death, throughout you've adopted the stance of seeking to blame everyone else rather than yourselves for what happened. I'll play the final part of the hearing where the sentence was passed, but we'll leave a link to the full thing in the description if you wish to see it.
Sentence. On gross negligence manslaughter, in your case, Mark Gordon, there will be an extended sentence of imprisonment amounting to 18 years, with a custodial term of 14 years and an extension period of 4 years. In my judgment, Gordon, in your case, the dangerousness test is met. I've given consideration to the provisions of Section 285 of the Sentencing Act 2020 and whether the seriousness of the offence or one or more of the other offences associated with it is such as to justify the imposition of a sentence of imprisonment for life. However, I do not find it to be. There will be the extended sentence that I've passed upon you. Martin, in your case, as the dangerousness test is not met, there will be a determinate sentence, a sentence of 14 years imprisonment. In your case, I've given consideration as to whether the custodial sentence should be of the same length as that passed in respect of Mark Gordon or not. Having reflected on the issue, I am of the view that the custodial terms should be of the same length. The issues around future risks have led me to the conclusion that Mark Gordon should be the subject of an extended sentence, and there is therefore that distinction between the two of you. On count 1, concealing the birth, the sentence in each of your cases are ones of 18 months imprisonment. Count 2, child neglect, the sentence in each of your cases again ones of 18 months imprisonment. On count 5, perverting the course of public justice, the sentence in each of your cases are ones of 5 years imprisonment. The sentences on counts 1, 2 and 5 are to be concurrent to each other and concurrent to the sentences on count 4. Gordon, in your case, what that means is it's likely you will serve 2/3 of that custodial term that I've imposed. If released at the end of that custodial term or at the 2/3 point, you will be on licence until the expiry of the extended period of licence in your case. Martin, in your case, you will serve 2/3 of the sentence I've imposed and then be released on licence. Released on licence, you are subject to the terms of that until the expiry of the custodial term. As the statutory surcharge clearly applies here, the appropriate orders can be drawn up.
So, to clarify, for causing the death of their newborn daughter Victoria through their absolute negligence and complete disregard for human life, 37-year-old Constance Marten and 51-year-old Mark Gordon were both sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. The judge passed the sentence while they have to serve 2/3 of this time in prison as a minimum, so 9 years 4 months, before they can be considered for release. So, based on this, and taking into account time they spent on remand, this pair could be back in the world in 6 years 9 months' time, so around June 2032. Why should these monsters ever be released when Victoria is gone forever? When I first heard about this case, I did draw some initial conclusions, including that Mark Gordon was a domineering and controlling man, and that he was abusive to Constance Marten, and that he tapped into something that was already there. For those who have followed this channel for a while, these are all factors we've seen before. I believe I was right, but the more I looked into it, the more I realised just how awful both of these individuals are in their own right, especially Constance. With these more complicated cases, I'm tending to break things down in chunks during the video, then bringing everything together at the end, so I've mentioned many of my thoughts on this pair. Mark Gordon is, and has been since he was a child, an extreme danger to women. He sees them as nothing more than a means to an end, to gain sexual gratification, to seek a sense of power and control. He's a narcissist, possibly psychopathic. He has no empathy or remorse for people. He was released from prison after 20 years, and instantly, when looking for a vulnerable woman to get his claws into. And then he met Constance Marten. I imagine he thought he struck gold because of just how damaged this woman is, and how many of her traits match his own. With her, as I said, she has significant issues regarding abandonment, especially related to her father. She was clearly trying to fill that gap throughout her life. What she saw and experienced in the cult of TB Joshua, I don't believe she's ever opened up about fully, but it messed her up badly, and Mark was easily able to assign himself Daddy Bear, and he manipulated and controlled her for years. I think with Mark Gordon, children were his way of tying in Constance, meaning that she couldn't leave him. This is a common tactic of domestic abusers, but I have a niggling feeling about something much more dark. So I noted that Mark was known as the preacher in prison. I imagine part of this would have included because of how much he clearly loved attention, hence his performance in court, giving sermons. Also, I've no doubt that Constance told him about her experiences with TB Joshua in Lagos. Him getting her to call him Daddy, just like Joshua did, makes me think he potentially had aspirations of being a cult leader too. Perhaps he thought that his children could be his first disciples. Whilst Mark Gordon might have identified Constance Marten as being very damaged, I think he was slightly surprised by just how immature, self-absorbed and narcissistic she was in her own right. This, I imagine, made her far easier to manipulate, but it was something that was already there. I too was shocked about just how immature this woman was. She was such a child. She literally seemed to do the exact opposite of what people said just to be defiant. As a child, this may involve taking sweets from a bowl when you've been told not to, but with Constance, it was about having a child. She was told no, so she deliberately acted in a way to defy everyone. So her parents didn't want her to have a relationship with Mark. Screw them, I'm going to have a baby with him. Social services kept taking her babies away. Screw them, I'm going to keep having babies until they let me keep one. All of her thinking was about herself, what she wanted, and because of her immature attitude, what she wanted was essentially whatever people told her she shouldn't have or couldn't have. When she got the babies, she had no idea what she was doing. She would drink when she was around them and wouldn't take advice of anyone. Of course she knew best. She reminds me of a child walking around with a doll whose hair was all fallen out because it's been brushed too hard and one leg is pointing in the wrong direction, and they bang the doll's head against the door, but they're walking around happily cradling it in their arms, sometimes upside down, completely unaware that anything is wrong. I think this is the mentality of Constance Marten, a grown woman. I think this is the only way to explain why she, apparently with a straight face, honestly seems to believe that having her child in a tent in the middle of winter was a good thing. She wanted what she wanted, and nothing would stop her, and she made some truly deranged decisions, such as essentially living on the street when she had tens of thousands of pounds in the bank. I think, as I said earlier, this was primarily about not wanting to use ATMs so that people wouldn't track her, but I also think it was about perpetuating this bizarre victim mentality she developed. She seemed to be, oh, look at me, poor little Constance, having to live on the street, how hard done by am I, without wiping away a tear with a £50 note. Again, this is how a child would act, someone who has the ability to deal with the situation, but instead throws themselves on the floor and has a tantrum to get some attention. When she did actually have access to the children, who she apparently loved so much, via a contact centre, she turned up a few times, then didn't bother. A good analogy here is a child who begs for a toy for Christmas. They say it's all they've ever wanted, they'll do extra chores, and then when they get it, 2 weeks later, it's under the bed, never to be touched again. Constance Marten didn't want children. She wanted the idea of a child because she had been, in her mind, told she couldn't have one. So she had 5 children and looked after none of them. If she had kept custody of the children, I imagine eventually she would have palmed them off on relatives or a nanny to look after. In court, her immaturity was fully on display, but also her narcissism. She was incredulous that anyone was daring to tell her what to do. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know who my father is, etc. It's ironic that she described herself in one sentence in the court. I was completely clueless about it. She was also so self-absorbed that she admitted that one of the first thoughts after her daughter died was, man, this is going to make me look bad. No more photos in the tablet for me. I think this also demonstrates her real lack of empathy or remorse for anything she's done. I think the two are inextricably linked to her childhood. She was raised to believe she was special, but because of her absent parents, they didn't teach her how to value the feelings of others. She's entirely blinkered to what she wants. Nothing else matters. If people die as a consequence, then oh well. One of the things that makes me really mad in this case is realising how little real consequence there will be to either of these two. Mark Gordon served 20 years in prisons in the US, which I imagine make the ones in the UK look like holiday camps, and he has the potential of being released in less than 7 years' time. This is nothing to him. And when he comes out, he'll find more women to control and abuse, and he'll repeat this pattern until his dying day. He doesn't care. He never has, and he never will. With Constance Marten, potentially she'll get a kicking in prison, although she seems to be doing well after almost 3 years inside. But when she's released, she'll have her family funds to fall back on, and eventually she'll inherit part of her parents' estate. She will likely be, sometime in the future, a multi-millionairess. She will, I imagine, relocate somewhere in the world where she can disappear and live out her days in luxury. She won't be lonely. Unfortunately, no matter how reprehensible a person is, if they have money, they attract people. These may be vapid, soulless people who are just hanging around, hoping to profit off their association. But Constance doesn't care. She too is as empty as they are, and so she'll be in good company. The only thing that could bother her in the future is her guilt for what she did not only to Victoria, but all 5 of her children. But I don't think she has the ability to feel this. What do you think? So what are your thoughts on this case? I particularly want to know what you think of the sentences that were passed. If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel via the thanks button. I'm working really hard to get the channel to 100k subs, so please like, share, and most importantly subscribe. It might not mean much to you, but it means everything to me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.